Hi there fabric jugglers, it's Babs here from MyFieryPhoenix, and today I'm going to be taking you through a tutorial which hopefully will be both educational but also help benefit some others that are less fortunate than us. I'm doing a tutorial specifically to create the Pyjama Fairy wrap top for the pyjamas that they create to help children in hospitals. So if you're interested in that, then please stick around. There'll be details in the description box below about the Wrap Pyjama Fairies project. And in this particular tutorial, I'll be taking you through the kimono top. And in an upcoming tutorial, I'll also take you through the pyjama bottoms. Now what I've done in terms of marking out the pattern, I have taken the fabric and folded it right sides together along the selvage. This pattern has no particular direction, which makes the marking and cutting very, very straightforward. I don't have to worry about orientation whatsoever. And I've used my quilting ruler to make sure that everything is at right angles to the fold. And I have measured and double checked, which is why you may be able to see an error that I had on there, and this is why we need to double check and measure and then measure again. So this is a age 3 top, and if I just run through the measurements, I've used 28.25 centimetres across the top, 17 centimetres down, 12 centimetres in, 26.5 centimetres down, and then 16.25 back again, which, because it is being cut on the fold, this will be a perfectly symmetrical back piece. So I'll just cut that out using my rotary cutter. Again, just be very mindful of fingers as you are doing it. It should all cut away quite simply because it is just right angles all the way through the back portion. If you're not confident using a rotary cutter in the inner corners, then revert to scissors for those. And then one last slice. One word of warning for people who've not cut these before. I found that having marked out this back piece and realised just how tiny it was, I had to have a moment. It's only then that it brings home to you exactly how tiny these children are that are in hospital. So be prepared that you may well need a moment after cutting it out, just so that you can then carry on in a sensible frame of mind. It shocked me when I realised just how diddy these are. So if you're making an even smaller size, you may want to just be prepared that that might be a shock that affects you. Okay, and then we move on to the two front pieces. Now again, I've marked them against the fold, and this is so that I can then just cut down that piece and we know that they are all symmetrical. So I will just slice through again, and as you may be able to see, the lines that I used for the ruler along the edge to make sure that everything is symmetrical. The grid for my quilting ruler was incredibly useful for this process. Anyhow, we're back to cutting this out neatly. There are no measurements per se for this diagonal line. That is simply joining the edge of the top of the sleeve with the side. As long as everything else has been marked evenly, that won't be an issue. And then just making sure everything else comes away neatly. And this will give us our front and our back. Just lift that up there, we don't want it all moving. Pull this down gently and evenly. And then we'll just cut across the top of the sleeve. And then we do the angle. And again, this angle goes from A to G, I think it is. And then we just cut down. Then we have I just need to get the scissors. And then we simply cut along this last fold. And you then have your two fronts, which form the wrap. And you have your back. And the next stage will be pinning these together. So we open them out. We still have all those lovely right sides facing each other. Just making sure that everything does still fit. So that's one side. Take away all the loose threads. And here we have the other side. And as you can see, this is still a very diddy top, but it is fitting nicely. So I will go and grab the binding, I will grab my pins, and we'll move on to pinning and making sure the binding is as we need it to be. So now we can move on to cutting out our two 25cm strips of bias binding. This binding is going to be pressed again, but this is my homemade binding. If you don't know how to make binding, there is a link in this playlist to a tutorial that will show you how to do that. The first thing I'm going to do is cut off the pointy end and just cut that through, and then work out how long 25cm is, which, using my nice happily ready marked cutting board, will make that slightly easier. Don't pull on the binding, make sure that it is loose as you are deciding where the 25cm mark is, and then just cut through. And that's one, and then we'll create a second. And as I say, this will be pressed again. Quite clearly this is in need of a good pressing. And then we come back to the 25cm line, cut through. And these are going to create the two waist ties. The rest will be used for binding around the neckline. So I'll go away and press these, and I'm also going to sew them down so that one end is finished, and then the other end, which I will leave loose, will actually be captured in the side seams. So here I've pinned the two front pieces to the back. They're pinned across the shoulders, under the arms and down the sides, and I've taken extra care to match down the bottom so that when I come to do the final hem, everything is aligned very neatly at the bottom. I've got wiggle room pretty much everywhere else, but the bottom I need to be neatly aligned. I'm using a stitch length of 2, and I have gently reminded the binding what it should look like, which is 2 folds into the centre and then folded again, which gives us a 1/2 inch for either side. So I am going to fold one end under and then close that so that I have an enclosed end, and then stitch along there and then stitch down so that I have my ties with one open end. So I shall just move on and do that. And it may be worth using a stiletto or a pin if you are a perfectionist and want to have the raw edges kept under. And I'll back stitch this section just to make sure that everything is as I want it to be. always just hand crank this top portion, purely because it's such a narrow edge for the binding. And then one more. Leave the needle down, pivot, and then make sure that those loose ends are out of the way, and then I just run straight down the edge. And you can double check that you have no loose edges, which is fine, and then repeat for the other tie. Now that we have our ties completed with our finished ends and we have raw ends, we will be adding these into the sleeves just underneath the armpit, and we want to make sure that we have the raw edges hanging out this side. We want them to be positioned 1 inch down. I'll just grab a ruler which will show me where my 1 inch should be, and then I just tuck, and I always keep the seam edge down. So we'll just take the ruler out of the way first because that's too heavy. Right, so we have a raw edge peeking through. We should have the hemmed edge down and the natural fold up, and we just need to position this 1 inch down and then pin that in place. Turn the pin the other way around, otherwise you just get my hand completely in the way and you can't see it. So we've now pinned that in place. We have the finished edge coming away, and when we hem this edge, or when we seam this edge, this will be captured neatly for us. Now that we're moving on to the right hand side of the kimono wrap, we're not going to leave this hanging on the inside. We're actually going to make sure that it is hanging on the outside, so that it's not folded between the 2 layers of fabric. It's not travelling this way as our first example. It's actually going to be folded over at the end and then tucked into the seam allowance. And the reason I fold this over is so that if anything shows after we've sewn it in place, it will simply be a nice clean fold. So we'll pin that in place and then start sewing. Now that we have all this in place, we're going to sew with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, which for me is the width of my presser foot, which makes life that little bit easier. I'm going to back stitch, I'm going to back tack at every loose edge, and we'll be taking the pins out as we go. If you have to stop at any stage to take the pins out, always make sure the needle is in the down position. And then I back tack at the end. And then we're going to do the same for under the arm, and we will also be capturing the first of our ties at this point. Again, back tacking as I start. So we're continuing around with our 1 centimetre or foot width a seam allowance, and we're going to take extra care when we get to this corner. I'm just going to move this pin out of the way before it causes me a bit of a problem. And we're going to come down just a centimetre down so that we can then turn and come back along. leave the needle down and pivot round. Now this is where we make sure that we have the other sleeve out of the way, or the front piece out of the way, and that our tie is nice and even so that it's perpendicular. Drop the presser foot and then come on back down. What I tend to do is just reverse stitch over the tie to make sure that it is nice and secure. And then continue on down. Not that anyone should be tying these very tightly around a small child, but you just don't want those coming loose. Once you've done it on one side, simply flip it around and work it on the other side. Once you've completed the zigzagging to stop the raw edges from fraying, you need to make sure, you will have seen it in the video, but you need to make sure that you back stitch across the corner. And a quick tip that I use if I'm not sure, or if you're not sure of how far you can go to avoid this this line of stitching, pop a pin across the corner, and then no matter how hard you try, you cannot cut through that line of stitching once the pin is in place. So that's just if you're not sure how far to go with that nick to give you the reduced bulk in the underarm area, just pop a pin across the actual line of stitching, and that means you'll keep that nice and safe. For the hemming of the sleeves, it's a 1/4 inch turn followed by a 1/4 inch turn, and what I do here is, just to keep the bulk out of the way, I simply press the raw edges one direction, so they're going up here, then I continue on round, and this also goes in the same direction, so it looks like it's going down at the top and up at the bottom, and that just makes it easier for me to sew across the joins and the seams when I'm sewing my sleeve edges. The same goes for the hem at the base of the shawl. I press these towards the back so that it is just neat. It's easier for me to work with, and it just means everything's folding in the same direction, so I don't have to worry about lumps and bumps as I'm working that hem. The only parts that we hem are the straight edges, so we have the front piece, we have the bottom hem, and then we have the sleeves. Everything else has the binding, so this will be the neck and the front, the angles at the front. Those are the only pieces that have the binding. So you've got the angle, the back of the neck, and then the other angle. Don't forget, you should be allowing extra 25 centimetres of loose binding so that you can then use that as the tie. And there was a query this morning around what should happen with the piece of fabric which sticks up once the shoulder seams have been sewn, and we need to leave that sticking up, so just encase it within the binding. So you'll see me working through that, but just remember, nothing should be pressed down, it should be left up, because there should be no raw edges whatsoever, and one of the best ways to guarantee no raw edges is not to press them down. So now that we've got all of our raw edges tidied away, we just have one last raw edge, which is all the way around the neckline, and this also is where we create the rest of our ties. Do remember that you need to have about 25 centimetres at either end, because these will become the ties, along with the pieces that we've already put into the side seams. What I personally like to do is to pin everything in place, sew it all from the reverse first, then fold it all over and complete it, including the completing of the outside ties as one final step of sewing. So I'll just start off by attaching it to the wrong side of the kimono. And we don't need to worry too much about stitch placement, because this is going to be hidden by the fold that we make. So now that we've sewn the first part of the binding onto the neckline, what we do is then fold everything across, so that we enclose the seam line that we've just sewn, and everything is then neatly encased. So what I'm going to do is just sew from the front this time, because I want to be in control of what I'm seeing, and I'm going to start from the far end of the tie. So we're going to fold the tie over, fold it in, and then we're going to sew along this outside edge, and that is going to be the edge that, once we've folded everything over, we'll be sewing again here. Leave the needle down, rotate everything around, and then we start to sew this together. Now at this point I'm not gauging from the outside, I'm gauging from the inner edge. And I fold over as I go, to make sure that everything is aligned as I want it to be. Again, it's incredibly important that at this stage you make sure all of your fabric is lying flat and that you have folds as you want them to be. If you're not confident doing it this way, you can of course pin everything in place. It all becomes much easier once you've hit fabric, as you've now got a very solid guideline. All being well, you will be stitching through both sides in one process. At the corner where you come to the sleeve, you may just want to slow down and ease it around. And then move the fabric slightly more so that you have a straight line for across the back. And then be aware of where you're coming up to the next sleeve so that you can just manipulate that round. Ease that round and then straight on down the diagonal to finish. And always remember to put the presser foot down. The last thing you need is to get this far through the project and leave the presser foot up. And once you come through to the end, you then continue on down to the end, the far end of the binding, and then remember to fold the far end in. So before you get too close to the end, roll it under and fold it over so that you can then have a nicely enclosed ending. I always manually hand crank this last piece, and then make sure you use a reverse stitch to secure the last piece. There you have your completed. So once we've completed the two ties, we now have one on the outside of the top and a neck piece. We have a tab on the other side with the tie and the neck piece. And the reason we have this is so that we've got an inside tie and we then have an outside tie. So please, please, please make sure that you don't do that simple error of having two ties sticking out the sides. You need one on the inside and one on the outside, and that gives you this lovely little useful pyjama kimono top. Hopefully the tutorial was of use to you, and if I have piqued your interest in any way in the Pyjama Fairy projects, please, please, please do check them out. Have a look in the link below. This is a group of ladies and gentlemen who just spend their own time. They don't get paid. It's completely charity driven, and they make sets of pyjamas for small children and infants that are in hospital. as I say, there's lots of information down below if you want to check them out, and hopefully you will find this series of tutorials quite interesting. I talk about how to create binding, how to tell different types of fabrics from each other, so cottons versus polycottons, because the requirements for these garments are very, very specific. And I'll also be taking you through, I think there are maybe 4 or 5 different types of pyjama wrap, and then there's the pyjama bottoms to go with them, as well as the baby items. So there'll be quite a few tutorials all within one single playlist. As I say, hopefully that will have piqued your interest, and if it has, please like, share, comment in the description below the video, and dare I even say subscribe to the channel. But hopefully I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.